Yeah, so let's walk down this path. Let's go from like the beginning all the way up to your first CEO role. So, um, what role were you in? Was it the HGTV role when you said I want to be a CEO? Let's walk through this step by step. So, what role were you in when the kind of aha kind of said, you know what, I think I could lead a company?
So I was at the Outdoor Channel, which is a small television network that's all about hunting and fishing. It's in Southern California. And I had come into that as a director, director of research. My background was in market research. And I very quickly noticed there was not a coordinated marketing function at the Outdoor Channel. It was a small family owned network. It was a national network, but nonetheless pretty small. Came up with a proposal, took it to the CEO, and said, hey, I think you need a head of marketing. You need a real marketing function. You're spending, at that time, I think we were spending almost $5 million, but in all different pockets of the organization. So there was no continuity, no coordination, no real ROI tracking on the money we were spending. And for a small network, it was a lot of resource. So came up with this proposal, showed it to him. And he said to me at the time, I think this is great, but I want to see who else is out there in the marketplace to be the head of research. So I was, or the head of marketing. So I was pretty crushed. It was like, I'm the one who comes to you with the plan and the play and the idea, and you've decided you're going to go out and recruit somebody else for it. So I was actually pretty pissed. And 6 months went by and nothing happened. And honestly, I just figured it had died, right? That my proposal had died, that even maybe they weren't going to hire anybody. One day, the CEO saunters into my office and he says, if you want the job, it's yours. The budget is yours. All of it's yours. Go pursue your plan. And I was like, very, very surprised. So that kind of set me on a path. It set me on a path to learn how to be a leader. I knew absolutely nothing. Again, nobody trained me. Nobody, I wasn't prepared for it. Took on a team really quickly, but I was able to move through the ranks there pretty fast. So I was an EVP by the time I left. So it was interesting. I went to a really terrific leadership program. It was almost like a mastermind program for women in the television industry. And I did that in 2009. It lasted for 18 months, 09 to 2010. So in 2010, I'm literally sitting at my desk in my office, and I've got a legal pad in front of me. I turn it on its side, and I sketch out what I called at the time a blueprint, right? Just it looked like, chicken scratch. And it was literally like, what do I want to be? I want to be a CEO. How long do I think it's going to take me to get there? I said 5 years at the time. So it's 2010. I'm like, I think by 2015. If I do the following things, and I listed those things out, I think I can be a CEO. And those things were things like I needed to know how to read financial statements. I had come up through marketing. I didn't have a business degree. I have a degree in political science, and didn't know how to read financial statements. And people noticed it. At one of my performance reviews, someone said to me, my boss, who was the COO, said, hey, Denise, we can tell that you don't feel comfortable reading, financials, and you're going to need to figure that out. So I actually went and took a class at Stanford and figured that out. I knew I needed to be a better networker. I'm introverted. And, I was in Temecula, California. So I wasn't up in LA hobnobbing with the bigger network folks. I wasn't in New York doing the same. So I really had to jump out of my comfort zone and make time to get to know those people, right? And to get, for them to know me. So I did that. I had to learn how to manage up and sideways. That was something I was horrible at. And I actually hired an executive coach for the first time ever to help me with that. And I can say that was an absolute game changer. So for me, it was interesting. That was 2010. I get a call from a recruiter who honestly, I was just having a networking call with. She and I were friendly. And out of the blue, she said, hey, I have this role at HGTV. It's a CMO role. You'd be great for it. Come to think of it, are you interested? And I was like, yeah, sure. I knew I was going to need a CMO role. One, I needed that title, but two, I needed that from a bigger brand. So I went to HGTV in 2011. By the time I got to 2014 December is when I landed my first CEO job. So go back to my blueprint. My blueprint said 5 years. It was about 5 years. So what I say to my clients all the time is, and I'd say this to anyone running a business as well, because I apply it to my business now, there's power in writing down the things that you want. Doesn't mean that you're tethered to them. That doesn't mean they're written in stone. I think it just gives it some weight, and some real reality.
Yeah, 100%. Okay, so we get to HGTV. How many years were you there?
3.
3 years.
Yeah.
You leave HGTV in a blaze.
Yeah.
And what was the next role?
Next role was a company that was, when I came in, called Event Photography Group. It was at the time about an $80 million company backed by private equity, Raymond James, and another firm called Fred Scholar out of New York. And they had partnered to go into this investment. They went out and bought all the graduation photographers, mostly for college in the United States. So they
Wow.
literally bought about 18 different businesses, brought them together, consolidated that industry. And it definitely was a good size industry. And they really needed a fresh take on the business. And that fresh take on the business required them to build a marketing function. So initially, when they hired me, I was hired as a CMO. I wasn't hired as a CEO. So I come I officially start in, 2015, January. And I'm working for this CEO who had been with the company for 10 years. They had failed an exit. Shutterfly was slated to buy them, and then they didn't pass due diligence. So it was a huge hit to the CEO's morale and kind of everybody else's morale, because they were like, okay, what's next, right? What's going to happen? So while that CEO was licking his wounds, the private equity folks hired me, and the whole intention was I was supposed to train for a year or two under him, learn how to be a CEO, right? From someone who'd been doing it for 10 years. And then I'd jump into his seat. Well, I'm there for 6 months and the morale is horrible. Nothing's moving forward. Everything's a mess. He won't even get out of my way so I can, build a marketing department. So I go back to the private equity guys and I'm like, hey, either something's going to change here or I'm going to leave. And they were like, well, I guess you're going to become the CEO. So I had only been there for 6 months, got promoted to CEO, and the business was messy. I mean, it was, no doubt, it had a nice stable revenue base, but that revenue base, it was seasonal, and it wasn't going to make itself, right? So there were some things that needed to happen from a process, from a tech perspective. So, thankfully I got the role. I was there for how many years? Just under 4. And we exited. We exited and sold the business to a strategic buyer, which was pretty cool for a first-time CEO. Yeah, that was my very first CEO role. We had 10,000 employees when I left, and we were a $130 million business.
Wow. So I want to dive into this moment because I think I want to unpack it so that our audience gets a good understanding of how this really works. So
Yeah,
you know the players that are involved while you're the CMO with the CEO, and you know behind them is these private equity group, and
I
they're the
don't.
ones
I don't.
really. You say that again?
I don't. I don't know anything about private equity. I am totally ignorant at this point.
Yeah. So then you find out that, oh, wait a minute, there's this group behind this guy, and they kind of have plans for the business. And then 6 months later, now they're like, you make this, reaction, and they're like, well, then tag, you're it. Talk to me about what was the first thing that you saw, because you mentioned there was, it was a kind of a mess, right? And unfortunately, most people don't know until they get behind the wheel anyway, um, of anything, right? But you recognize there's a mess. Now you're in this role. They've sent out the company email, hey, effective such and such. Denise is now the CEO, and people are like, what the heck just happened?
Right.
What is like one of the first initial things that you saw? And what was one of the first things that you knew you wanted to tackle that would actually move the needle? Because I think, you mentioned earlier, you make a CEO, you're making the tough decisions, and, you're moving people around, right? But a lot of times, some of those difficult decisions that need to get made, I would imagine at a CEO's level, are more complicated than what people think they are. It's like, yeah, we know we need to do this, but I've got to actually get several other things moving in order to move this needle. So talk to me about like the first thing you saw, and then what was the first thing that you decided to tackle that you knew you needed to make a move on?
The first thing that I saw was, the board relationship between the previous CEO and the board. And the board of directors consisted largely of some guys from Raymond James, one of the private equity firms, some other guys from the other private equity firm. And then you had one guy who had owned one of the businesses that was acquired that was the most successful business, right? So he still had a little bit of skin in the game and he had a board seat. And what I noticed as just in those first 6 months as the CMO, I noticed that the CEO, my predecessor, used to keep things from the board. And they were things, quite frankly, that the board needed to know about from a materiality perspective. So there was a lot of hiding, there was a lot of shading, a lot of shrouding. There was also a lot of talking behind the board, behind their backs, which is never good. So, for example, the previous CEO would come to me and he would, me and the other folks in a room full of his executives and say, "Oh, so and so on the board's a complete jerk and he doesn't know what he's doing," and things like that. Well, that's not cool because eventually you're going to eat your words. It's just it's a bad way to operate. So the first thing I decided is that, and I said this to the guys when they offered me the role, I said we have to have complete transparency, me and you guys, everybody on the board, because if we don't, and I don't have that safety, psychological safety was not a term then, but if it was, I would have used it. I have to have the safety to be honest with you. And they were like, absolutely, yes. We know that the current CEO keeps things from us. So that's what we want to. And I will say they held up to their word on that. They were honest and forthright. So for me, the first thing I did was I was very open with them about this is good, this is bad, and this is ugly. Let me show it to you. But then also let me show you how we can fix this, right? What the solution is. The second thing I wanted to do is be able to understand who belonged in what seat, right? The first thing I want to do, any role I've ever had, but certainly as a CEO, I want to know if people are in the right seats or should they even be on the bus, quite frankly. Maybe, they shouldn't be on the bus. To be fair, there are different people required for different phases in an organization and in the evolution of an org. And not everybody makes that cut for every phase. And I can say that I haven't made that cut for every phase in my career. So I wanted to figure out, do I have the right people that I need? I had some of them. I had some that were just impediments that I needed to exit, right, in a decent way. And always hard though. I don't care how nice you say you are or how good the severance package is. Like it's hard for them, it's hard for you. It's a bad situation to have to exit people, but you have to do it for the greater good. So those were the two things that I really focused on. One thing I noticed too really early on, I wanted to set the tone for what my brand of leadership was going to be like. And I noticed we had a very long institutional memory in the organization. The example was there was a woman who was the COO, and she was on my team. I had inherited her. She had been with the org for 30 years, was really good at her job, really knew what she was doing. And she had one bad year in 2009. And one could argue that her year was bad because she's operations and everything rolls downhill to operations, right? If there's a mess to be made, that's going to roll onto the ops team. And so the folks who owned the business, the private equity guys, went out and bought all these businesses in 2009, right? A lot of new businesses, two that were just giant. And then they basically said to her 2 months, they buy these businesses a few months before our season is happening in our seasonal revenue cycle. And they're like, hey, integrate these businesses and make sure everything goes smoothly. And she's like, okay. She takes it on like a champ. But at the end of the day, a lot of balls dropped, a lot of things failed. It was just not good. And instead of them taking that on for themselves, they decided, the folks on the board, that they were going to hang that loser sign around this woman's neck, which was wholly unfair. Right. So I'll never forget being in a meeting and they're like, remember, this person in 2009. And I was like, what are you talking about? And then when they explained it to me, I was like, okay, from now on, we're not talking about that anymore because it doesn't serve anybody. Right. And by the way, everyone in this room should probably take some responsibility for that. That's not just on her. So I think that was the other thing is I kind of wanted to drop the mic and say to people, we're going to run this thing a little bit differently and we're going to be fair, right, in our assessments of other people.
Thank you so much for checking out this clip. Stay tuned so that you can make sure that you grab the full episode when it is released, coming soon. Subscribe, like, and share today.